Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to have with me today Dr. Frederick W. Kagan. I reached out to some of my contacts who have some intellectual credibility and some political expertise to find out who could be contacted to provide an update for everyone, me included, on the unfolding situation in Russia and Ukraine. And Dr. Frederick Kagan, his name popped up instantly. So I'll give you a bit of a bio and then we'll get right to the issue, what's happening in the Ukraine. Dr. Frederick W. Kagan is author of the 2007 report, Choosing Victory, a Plan for Success in Iraq. He's one of the intellectual architects of the Surge strategy in Iraq. He's the director of the American Enterprise Institute's Critical Threats Project and a former professor of military history at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. His books range from Lessons for a Long War, American Enterprise Institute Press, 2010, co-authored with Thomas Donnelly, to The End of the Old Order, Napoleon in Europe, 1801 to 1805, Da Capo Press, 2006. He worked as an assistant professor of military history at West Point from 1995 to 2001, and as an associate professor of military history from 2001 to 2005. Dr. Kagan holds a PhD in Russian and Soviet military history from Yale. So welcome. Thanks for agreeing to talk to me today. I very much appreciate it. I'm looking forward to this insofar as you can look forward to a discussion about such topics. And so we'll get right to the heart of the matter, I guess, in the most pointed manner possible. Maybe you could give us some sense of what's happening right now, and then we'll move to why and what we should do about it. But as far as you're concerned, how should we be understanding the events that are unfolding in Ukraine?
So several days ago, I confess I've lost all track of time, but several days ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin launched an unprovoked and unjustified and illegal attack on Ukraine for the purpose of conquering it. He has conducted air and missile strikes against multiple targets across the entire country. And he has launched a ground invasion along multiple axes. His objective is very clearly to take control of the Ukrainian government in Kyiv, but also take control of a lot of other territory in Ukraine. He obviously aims at a minimum to replace the pro-Western government headed by Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's current president, and install some kind of governance structure that will bring Ukraine, as he sees it, back into the Russian fold. It's not at all obvious to me or anyone really what kind of governance structure Putin has in mind at this point, but it is very clear that he intends to do this at the muzzle of the tank, and that he is willing to kill quite a lot of people and do quite a lot of damage in Ukraine in order to regain control of the country. And that is what is going on. In short, it's part of a larger effort that Putin is engaged in to reconstitute the Soviet Union in some way, or possibly the Tsarist Empire in some way. The geographies of the Soviet Union and the Tsarist Empire had interesting overlaps and underlaps, and it's important to keep in mind that Putin refers to both when he's talking about what his aims are. And then just, the last larger thing to zoom out from all of that, he's been very explicit about his intention to destroy the NATO alliance, to break the ties between the United States and Europe, to change the world order fundamentally, and to return the United States to what he regards as its proper sphere, which is a Western hemispheric power.
So let me ask you some questions about the way you answered that. So you started out by saying unprovoked, unwarranted, and illegal, and then you switched so I'd like to delve into that, why all of those. And then one might conclude that there's territorial ambitions here in some sense, and he is moving troops into a large geographical area of some value merely because it's a geographical area. But you also highlighted the importance of a shift in governance in Ukraine away from a pro-Western governance structure. And so how much of this should we assume is territorial in some sense, and how much of it is his desire to create a subordinate state? Is it a state subordinate to him, or is it more important to him, do you think, that it's not pro-Western?
His objective is very explicitly to change the political order in Ukraine. It's not about territorial conquest per se. It's about ending Ukraine's ambitions to be part of the West to begin with. But he has written lengthy articles and he has given lengthy speeches explaining that he thinks that Ukraine has no right to exist as an independent state, that it has no nationhood, that it is simply a natural part of Russia that was reft from Russia by the stupid Soviets, and then by what he has called the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, which was the fall of the Soviet Union. So it's apparent from everything that he says that his ultimate objective is to regain full control over Ukraine in some way. The exact way in which he would govern a reconquered Ukraine is not yet clear, but that he is insisting that it be in Russia's sphere of influence, under Russia's control, is not in question.
So let's ask about this idea of the Russian sphere of influence, because one of the things that puzzles me in some sense is why doesn't Russia conceptualize itself as part of the West? Like, why does Russia insist upon viewing itself as an entity independent of the West, especially given the fact that it isn't exactly obvious that Putin is an admirer of what happened under Lenin and Stalin in the Soviet Union. And so I don't understand why we have to have this notion that it's Russia against the West. It's why he doesn't trust the West. We don't trust him. Like, what's the dynamic? I know they're trying to find a fourth way or something like that philosophically in Russia. Why are we in this situation where Russia doesn't conceptualize itself as part of the West?
I love this question. This is great because you let me get in, do some of my nerdly historian stuff here. To begin with, Russia has never considered itself fully part of the West. When Peter the Great broke a window into Europe, in the magical phrase of Pushkin, by establishing St. Petersburg, Peter attempted, who is one of Putin's two great heroes in Russian and Soviet history, the other one being Stalin. Peter was trying to Westernize Russia. And ever since then, there has been a debate within Russia about whether Russia really is Western or part of the West, or whether it is something else. In the 19th century, this manifested itself particularly in the divide in Russian intelligentsia between Westerners and Slavophiles. And you had people like Leo Tolstoy arguing for the inherent Russian soul as being distinctive and unique. From the end of the Napoleonic Wars on, Russia politically has regarded itself as something more than European. And the acquisition of Asian territories, among other things, in the 19th century has led Russians to see themselves as European. And also, throughout the 19th century, obviously, the West was Europe. The United States was not a big player in being the West. In the 20th century, it's hard to know exactly where Russia would have gone, except that Bolshevism, which triumphed in 1917, was an explicit rejection of the Western political economic model and a move in a different, unique direction. So there was a narrative of Russian uniqueness, and there is an inherent sort of Russian messianism, and the messianism actually goes all the way back to Ivan the Terrible. And I'm happy to talk about that if you'd love to delve into ancient history. But there are these strands in Russian thought going back centuries that Russia is a unique kind of place and that it must be a unique kind of place. And then, of course, as the Soviet Union was one of two global superpowers with the United States, when Putin is talking about the geostrategic calamity of the fall of the Soviet Union, what he really means is the loss of Russia's privileged position as one of the two rulers of the world. And what he is aspiring to is reestablishing that.
Oh, I've tried to understand this Russian exceptionalism. I mean, I'm an admirer of Russian literature, and Solzhenitsyn certainly did feel that it would be appropriate for Russia, if it could throw off the shackles of its Soviet totalitarianism, to return to the Russian Orthodox tradition that undergirded the Tsarist regimes, let's say. And he felt that a return to that would produce the foundation that would allow proper movement forward. But that still, to me, doesn't exactly seem to justify claims that in some sense this is a non-Western enterprise. I mean, insofar as it's grounded in Orthodox Christianity, it's still grounded in Christianity, which makes it broadly Western. And I've tried to understand.
But no, but not
okay.
Not in the Russian historical conception, because the messianism was established under the Ivan rulers was the notion of Moscow as the third Rome. And the argument was that first there was Rome and Christianity was founded there. Christianity moved to Constantinople. And then when Constantinople fell in 1453, the Russian Orthodox Church began to make the argument that the center of Christendom had moved to Moscow, which was the inheritor of the true faith. And so in that sense, it is a line of Christianity that rejects sort of Rome as the center anymore, runs through Constantinople to Moscow and claims to be its own center. And so even in that sense, defining Christianity as a Western thing in this sense is problematic within the ideological framework that Putin and others operate in.
Well, so they see that as more embedded in the remnants of the Byzantine Empire and in the separation from Constantinople and Rome a very long time ago.
Correct.
And do you know anything about the relationship between the Orthodox Christian authority hierarchy in Russia and the hierarchies of authority in Rome? Are the relationships good, or does the Orthodox hierarchy itself regard itself as something separate entirely and in opposition to the?
It is separate. The Orthodox hierarchy in Russia does not regard itself as under the edicts.
No, but are the relationships friendly, and is there communication, or
there's communication, and successive popes have reached out to patriarchs to talk with them. But one of the things that it's important to understand is that Putin has carried on the tradition of the Tsars of subordinating the Moscow Patriarchate to himself. And so the Moscow Patriarchate at this point is fundamentally an arm of the Russian government. And so he controls it de facto. It is not an independent religious authority in reality, even though it is ostensibly. And so its relations with the Vatican are whatever Putin decides he's willing to have them be at any given moment. I don't understand there to be a particularly contentious relationship, except, and it wasn't with the Vatican actually. Most recently, if you want to get really nerdly on this, there was a big fight a couple of years ago because the Ukrainian Orthodox Church had been a component or subordinated to the Moscow Patriarchate. The formal leader of all of the Orthodox communities is in Istanbul. And a few years ago, I forgot exactly when, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church petitioned the Patriarch in Istanbul to grant it autocephaly, to make it independent of the Moscow Patriarchate, and that was granted. And so the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has become an independent entity directly under the the Istanbul Patriarch. And Putin bitterly resented that, hated it, attacked it, and it is one of his grievances that, in fact, that occurred. That was not done by the Pope. That was done by the Patriarch
Right.
in Istanbul.
Well, people might be wondering why we've taken a detour into a religious direction, but the answer is we're trying to sort out the issue of the degree to which Russia rightly regards itself as an autonomous community independent of the West. And in order to answer that question properly, you have to delve down to the bottom of the cultural separation. And near the bottom is, well, the relative autonomy of the Orthodox Church. And I have talked to people in Washington who are associated with the Orthodox Church in Russia, and they do claim that Putin goes to confession and that there is some validity to his claims to have adopted some approximation of Orthodox Christianity. That obviously leaves open the issue of what the relationship is between the political power and the church power. It doesn't seem to be entirely unidirectional. And one of the things that also is a mystery to me in relationship to that is that you can trace a fairly clear line of development of democratic thought in the West proper to Protestantism in particular, which is grounded in Christianity. And there's a fair bit of emphasis on individual sovereignty in Orthodox Christianity, but there wasn't a development into a democratic polity in the same way there was, especially in Northern Europe. And I can't really understand why that is. It doesn't seem to be a doctrinal issue exactly that stems from the faith itself, but I don't have any more.
I'm about to reach the limit of expertise that I'm comfortable talking about, but I will make the observation that one of the central characteristics of Protestantism is that apart from England after Henry VIII, Protestantism was independent of state control.
Right.
And even Catholicism was independent of state control for most of the history of the West after the fall of Rome. And so that I think that independence from state control has been an important element in the fact that Western religion, that Christianity in the West, it's created space, as it were, by creating this separation, this gap between church and state, in which
at the level of detail, the level of legislation and actual interactions between the church and the state.
Yeah, and just this is what, of course, why one of the reasons Henry VIII took control of went to the Protestant Anglicanism and took control of his own church, because he was aggravated at having the Pope, have a say in anything. But in most other countries in Europe, the Pope continued to have a say in things for a long time, and it created a little bit of space. That was never the case in Russia. We never had an independent patriarch who could create that space from the Tsars, into which something else could happen, because it was always fundamentally, at least from the Muscovite period on, it was the Orthodox Church was always fundamentally under the control of the Tsar. And so it was a state religion, and it just did not have the ability to create that kind of space. And then there's a bunch of other sociocultural reasons that, as a historian, I'd love to nerd out about why the Russians didn't develop Western traditions of personal liberty and independence and that kind of stuff. But this religious aspect has to do with state capture, state control of the church, I think, more than anything else.
Right. So too much integration at the top, that's how Mussolini defined fascism in some sense, although he was thinking more about it in terms of collusion between the corporate world and the political world. But so you need autonomous organizations as close to the top as you can get. At least that's how it's worked in the West. Okay, so we've talked about why Russia might regard itself as somehow importantly separate. I mean, you could also say that about any number of countries within the West. It's not like Germany and England are the same place, or France and England, or France and the United States. We've been able to develop an integrated West to some degree that also allows for autonomy. So I still can't exactly see why the Russians can't be brought under that umbrella. Certainly the idea that they've lost their empire and they've lost their central place, I don't know if there's a resentment that goes along with that, or a confusion about place.
Yeah, before you even get there, I mean, look, you can't understate the importance of the Bolshevik Revolution in this regard, because the Romanov dynasty, especially in the 19th century, regarded itself as a part of Europe as well as something more. It regarded itself as European plus. And it regarded itself as a sort of a European superpower, but it regarded itself as part of the concert of Europe and a pillar of the concert of Europe. So the change comes when you have a revolutionary cabal take power that is dedicated to the destruction of all of the fundamental principles of the West. And that was the Bolshevik Revolution. And it took control, and it imposed its ideology by unbelievably brutal force on a population that didn't start believing in it. And that ideology involved not only that every aspect of the socio-political economic structure of the West was evil, but that it was seeking to destroy Russia, and that it was seeking to destroy this virtuous Bolshevik Revolution. So we can talk about the historical Russian theories of encirclement and various other things, which frankly can be easily overstated when you go back into Russian history. But the Bolsheviks absolutely saw themselves as the kernel of a world revolution, and assumed naturally that the entire capitalist world was seeking to destroy them. And to be fair to them, of course, the initial reaction of the Western powers was, in fact, to try to crush the Bolshevik Revolution. And we did have American troops land in Russia during the Civil War to try to help the white forces defeat the Bolsheviks. So there was an initial Western, and the British and the French did too. So there was an initial sort of Western intervention against the Bolshevik Revolution, which gave just a little bit of color to this. But the anti-Westernism and the notion of an encirclement and being at permanent war with the entire capitalist world is inherent to Marxism and Leninism. And then what did the Bolsheviks do? They systematically cut the Soviet society off from the world and took all control of communications, prevented people from leaving the Soviet Union. It's one of the ways that you can tell a legitimate state from a prison with a government is, does it allow its people freely to leave? And the Soviet Union did not. The Soviet Union, the laws prevented people from leaving without special permissions and so on. And so it was a prison with a government.
That's the certain hallmark of a totalitarian society is that you cannot, it's a prison, essentially.
Right, exactly right. So that was
so the Russians, so that you think there's inertia in some sense, even though Russia is no longer a Bolshevik state, you think there's inertia in the distrust of the West that probably developed even before the Bolshevik Revolution?
I don't think that there was a huge amount of inertia along those lines among Russians themselves, but now we need to talk about Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, who was a mid-rank KGB thug, who claims never really to have believed in the communist claptrap that he was putting out, which wouldn't make him unique among the Soviet apparatchiki. But who nevertheless obviously imbibed a sense of Soviet patriotism and some kind of belief in aspects of that ideology, and has certainly accepted the Soviet theory that the world is out to get Russia, and accepted that paranoid doctrine. Because, I mean, as you know, Jordan, ideologies are large, sprawling, and complex. People can believe in parts of them while rejecting other parts of them. I'm willing to believe that Putin was never a committed communist per se, but it is apparent that Putin accepted the special destiny of the Soviet Union or Russia in the world to be a superpower and to have influence beyond the norm, and accepted that the world was hostile and was seeking to prevent the Soviet Union or Russia from having that role.
Okay, so then is it the case then that, and this is part of the expression of political variability in opinion that you hear expressed in the United States right now, it was definitely the case, and correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that after the Soviet wall fell, that the West did take steps quite rapidly to try to consolidate some of the border territories between the former Soviet Union and the West, and to invite the Baltic states and so forth into a much closer partnership with the West. And a lot of that happened quite quickly. And then Ukraine was sort of left in an in-between state for a long time. So it didn't get moved west as fast as some of the other states did.
Yeah, I'd like to clean up the history here, because I think that the details matter. So the Soviet Union formally ends at the end of 1991. There is discussion about exactly what's going to happen to Germany and about whether East Germany is going to become a part of NATO, and the Russians have a certain idea of what they were told, and we have a different idea of what they were told. There were no formal commitments one way or another, but it ended with Germany being reunited and then all of Germany remaining in NATO. There was no further expansion of NATO until 1997. Okay, so that's very important. It is not like in 1990, it's not like the year after the Soviet Union fell, NATO expanded. Nor is it the case that the messages that were going from the West to Russia were, we're going to take all of the non-Russia parts of the former Soviet Union into NATO, but you Russians need to stay out. You're the adversary. On the contrary, NATO reached out to Russia also, and NATO established the Partnership for Peace program. And Russia was a member of the Partnership for Peace program, along with all of the other former Soviet states. And NATO did offer various forms of technical assistance. The US offered various forms of technical assistance to Russia in the 1990s, most of which the Russians rejected, some of which they accepted, which were very important. And there was a lot of cooperation, because it's important to note that when Boris Yeltsin was president, he did not identify the West as the enemy. He sought to integrate into the West. He sought to westernize Russia, and he did to a considerable extent. And he sought to democratize Russia, and he did. And he had to fight off multiple efforts by the Communist Party of the former Soviet Union to regain power and reestablish communist rule. And he fought against that, and we did try to help him with that. But the first NATO expansion doesn't happen until 1997, and it did not include the Baltic states. The Baltic states were admitted in, I think, 2003, 2004, I've forgotten the exact date in there, but they were not admitted in that first tranche. So the notion that we somehow just immediately started snapping up, former Warsaw Pact states and then Baltic states into the alliance is false. Nor is it the case that that was initially done in a way, in the way that we expressed it to the Russians, as being aimed at threatening Russia. These states sought admission into the alliance. And look, we've got to recognize that the alliance was formed on a principle of an open door policy that is inherent, that is innate in the North Atlantic Charter that founded the alliance, that any state can request admission to the alliance. This is one of the things that Putin is demanding that NATO change. But that provision was not added or created after the end of the Cold War. It was created when the alliance was created. Now, obviously, the alliance doesn't have to choose to admit any particular member, but we can now ask another question, which is what did we, the West, think that NATO was doing in the 90s? And why were we admitting these former Warsaw Pact and then the Baltic states to the alliance? Yes, we wanted to make sure that we had a buffer against the kind of threat that the Soviets had brought into Central Europe, because it's important to keep in mind that the Cold War was shaped by the fact that whereas we, the United States and Britain, and then a restored France, as we liberated territories, we made them free. And we offered them the opportunity to join NATO. They did join NATO, and which became a very rambunctious alliance, which periodically told the United States to pound sand, and which we did not run as an empire, Soviet rhetoric notwithstanding. And it was an alliance of free states, and it is a purely defensive alliance. There's absolutely no offensive provision in the NATO Charter anywhere. So that's what we did. What did the Soviets do? Well, when the Red Army rolled into Eastern Europe, it did not liberate anybody. It drove off the German forces, and then it took control of those countries, installed puppet states, which were ruled from Moscow. How do we know that? Because there were periodic revolutions in the Eastern European states, which the United States and NATO did not foment and did not support, and which the Soviets crushed brutally with tanks repeatedly. So they established an empire in Eastern Europe, and they brought millions of forces into the heart of Europe and threatened to overrun all of Western Europe. And that was the threat against which NATO was formed. I tell you all of that to say that people talk about the buffer that the Russians feel that they need against the West. the NATO expansion was about giving the West a buffer from the threat that it had just managed to drive off of vast Soviet mechanized armies in the heart of Europe, poised to overrun all of the West. So there was absolutely a security thing. NATO is a security alliance, and the big part of this was gaining a buffer for the West so that Europe could actually have peace and develop peacefully and without fear, which the threat of Soviet invasion throughout the Cold War had denied it. But in addition to that, the NATO accession was also meant to help bring those Warsaw Pact states and then the Baltic states into compliance with NATO standards, which is not just about military stuff. It's also about legal, moral, ethical frameworks, about how we fight wars, about how we treat our soldiers, about how the military interacts with the civilian population. It was meant to be part of an effort that was successful to help those countries develop healthy democracies and healthy free market economies. And we invested
and the capacity for some autonomous function at the national level, or for full autonomous function at the national level.
Right, complete,
Right, so
we don't control them, right.
So you're laying out an argument essentially that claims that to view this as a duopoly, let's say it's the US and its satellites against Russia and its satellites, that's a profound misapprehension of the historical reality, because it wasn't Russia and its satellites, it was the Soviet Union, which was a bloc, and it's America with its allies. So America sits as first among equals, let's say, something like that, in a voluntary organization that's predicated on the preservation of freedom at the political level and at the economic level. And if we want evidence for that, we look at the response of the wall in Berlin, for example, to take not the least of the examples, but the crushing of Hungary and Czechoslovakia and almost Poland when the Soviet Union did fall, and look at the response to any manifestation of genuine autonomy on the part of the Soviets. So, okay, well, we still have a question that's lurking constantly in the background. It's like, why in the world would the Russians are prone to reject an invitation to become part of the sovereign voluntary association of Western states? For some reason, they distrust the West. We've talked about that. They regard themselves as having an autonomous destiny, but hypothetically, that could have still happened. So let's take a slightly different tack. Let's imagine we're trying to figure out, what did we do wrong in negotiating with the Russians in the last 20 years, and what did the Russians do wrong in conceptualizing themselves and in negotiating with us? So let's start with us, maybe. Like, we're in this situation.
Well, hang on. Before we do that, there's a sea change that happens in Russia when Putin takes power, because Yeltsin had been one thing, and then Putin is something else entirely. And Putin had become an anti-communist in the 1990s, and he helped Yeltsin fight off the attempts of the communists to regain power. And initially, I think, by the way, Putin identified himself as a Democrat and someone who was in favor of democracy, which worked for him as long as he was actually winning elections, handily and didn't have to rig them. And he didn't have to rig the first few elections very much, and he could allow them to be relatively free because he was popular. But it's Putin who brought a new approach to this. And it's Putin who brought a real sense of grievance and anger. And the grievance was about the fall from greatness of the Soviet Union. Now, the one thing that it is necessary to have in people's minds here, the 1990s was a horrific time for Russians. Mm-hmm. Okay. I want to set aside the question of our responsibility or what we did or couldn't have done, because the truth is, I will assert, and I would be happy to argue with anybody about that, this wasn't our fault and there wasn't much we could have done about it, frankly, anyway.
Are you talking about the 90s specifically?
About the 90s,
or about what's, yes.
About
Well,
the 90s.
The 90s were a catastrophe. My former son-in-law was Russian, and he said often when he went to school, him and his close relatives who were also attending school weren't necessarily sure they were going to come home alive through much of the early 90s.
It was crazy. I was there in 1995 doing research in the Russian archives, and The ruble dropped from 3,000 to the dollar to 5,000 to the dollar in the 5 weeks that I was there doing research one time. It was absolute. I went to the first McDonald's on Tverskaya Square as it opened, and it was an amazing thing. So I saw a little bit. I mean, I was standing around. There were guards with AK-47s guarding vegetable markets as I would walk by them. You know, why was that going on? Because everybody was getting cuts and their rival gangs were controlling every aspect of it. And it was completely insane. It was a horrible period for Russians to live through. And it was an unbelievable humiliation for someone like Putin, who believes in Russia, that Russia should be one of the world's two superpowers, to have gone through that experience. So Yeltsin tried to lead his country through that with its democracy intact, and he succeeded until Putin destroyed it. Yeltsin was never able to fix the economy, really. So Putin comes in with a deep sense of grievance and burning with humiliation at what had happened to the Russians in the 90s. And he needed an explanation that came readily to hand for why that had happened. And on the one hand, he blamed Gorbachev for surrendering instead of fighting. And he bitterly resents the fact that Gorbachev didn't kill as many millions of people as he needed to just to stay in power. But he also blamed the West in many respects, mostly unfairly, honestly, for Russia's humiliation. And then we had a narrative rapidly emerge in the early Putin years that not only had the West contributed to Russia's humiliation in this way and mistreated Russia in various ways in the 90s, but now the West was trying to prevent Russia, as he kept saying, from rising from its knees. And that the West was trying to keep Russia down. And he began to elaborate a series of narratives which attributed all kinds of malevolence and, frankly, much more thinking and coherence in Western policies than has ever existed in them to us, and also made the mistake that most humans make of solipsism, of imagining that he was at the center of everybody's thought and that everything that we were doing in the world was aimed at Russia in some way. And so he created this narrative, which he has been pumping into the Russian population ever since.
Well, when things are going chaotically wrong, one of the simplest things to do always is to identify make a unitary assumption of cause and to make it external.
Of course.
It's convenient in 50 ways.
Right.
First of all, it gives you an enemy to unite against. It gives you an enemy to talk about politically. It solves your conscience. It's also very simple, because the reason that the former Soviet Union was so catastrophically chaotic in the 1990s, the reasons for that are unbelievably complicated and detailed. Right. And they go all the way from the highest levels of government to the nature of arrangements within families, right? The whole society was authoritarian for, 70 years, murderously authoritarian. And to unravel that and to take responsibility for it and to figure out how to fix it is way harder than to blame almost all of it on an external enemy. Right. Especially when you're also motivated, as you said, by this sense of thwarted destiny, which we could identify. I mean, in the West, we do regard a certain degree of patriotism as noble and justifiable. And you can see how that, under some conditions, noble and justifiable motivation would get hijacked if there was also reason to externalize blame for conditions, for resentment generated by genuine chaos.
Right. I mean, look, in addition to all the other factors you listed, we need to keep in mind how enormous was the task of trying to convert the Soviet economy to a free market. Basically, industrialization in Russia fundamentally happened under the Soviets, and it was done to a planned, centralized economy. So Russia is still littered today with what are called monotowns. They're towns of 500,000 people that exist around a single huge factory in which 75 or 100,000 people work. That was the Soviet model. The task of taking an economy built like that and turning it into a free market economy would have been unbelievably daunting with the best of the will in the world. And unfortunately, Yeltsin was preoccupied with the fight against the communists and keeping Russia democratic, I don't know whether he ever would have been able to undertake that mission successfully anyway, of marketizing the Russian economy, but he wasn't even able to concentrate on it.
Well, and as you point out, that's not merely a conceptual issue. Is
No,
part of the reason that free
right.
market frameworks work in the West is because the actual industries and micro industries and small shops are all autonomous and distributed, and so the legal structure matches the actual infrastructure. Whereas in the Soviet Union, as you said, because it was centralized, there's these massive entities that are not distributed or autonomous in any sense at all, and just changing the legal framework doesn't change that in the least.
Exactly. So it was a huge task, and all of this leads to the externalization of grievance and the feeding of a grievance narrative that blames the West, and then articulates this theory that the West is focused on preventing Russia from attaining its natural position of greatness in the world, and so on. And then Putin, who was a spy master, he wasn't a terribly good one with the KGB, but he was a spy master, launches on a new form of conflict, which we now call hybrid war.
Sorry, the phrase is hybrid war. Yeah.
A phrase that's very complicated to talk about and understand, but that includes information operations and information warfare that can best be characterized by the term gaslighting. And this is the stock and trade of the Russian hybrid warfare effort. There's a Soviet concept, and there was a terrific paper at the Institute for the Study of War that my wife Kim founded and runs, and that I work with the Russia team there. But there was a terrific paper that they published a few years ago by a woman named Maria Snegovaya on Russian reflexive control, a Soviet reflexive control doctrine, because it was Soviet theorists who articulated this framework in the 50s or 60s, I don't remember, that Putin and his goons have taken and perfected. Reflexive control is the art of creating a picture of the world in your adversary's mind of such a fashion that your adversary voluntarily chooses the course of action that you desire him to choose, thinking that it is in his best interest. That's a very complicated way of saying gaslighting, right? You create a false universe for the adversary to live in. And in that universe, the adversary will naturally do what you want him to do. This is what the Russians have been trying to do.
Okay, so I have two questions about that. The first is, as soon as anything like that is put forth, it instantly sounds like a conspiracy theory. And I'm not saying that you're engaging in conspiracy theories, but that's the reflexive response. So what's the evidence in your estimate?
Yeah,
and then what's the narrative they're trying to create? How effective has that been? And well, we already understand to some degree why. If the West is being conceptualized as an enemy responsible for Russian chaos, for keeping the Russians down, and for encircling them, depriving them of their just destiny, then we know the motive. There's others, but that's not a bad core motive. What's the warfare aimed at, and what's the evidence that this is occurring, and how and where and how are we subject to it, all of that?
So, right, as soon as you're operating in the information space, and as soon as you're dealing with this kind of psychological warfare and stuff, I will tell you there is a mountain of evidence that this is going on, and it's deliberate, and lots of people can argue with that. And we can argue about the specifics. But the evidence is, first of all, this is a published Soviet doctrine, which we can read. You can read this, where this is articulated. And then there is Russian doctrine on warfare and on hybrid warfare that also explicitly lays out this framework. So the barrier to entry here is reading Russian. If you can read Russian, then you can read official Russian doctrine and documents laying out the theory of hybrid warfare and how to conduct it. Now, there's one trick in the way that they tend to articulate this most clearly, and we've written about this as a terrific paper. I would commend to your attention by Mason Clark, the Russia team lead at the Institute for the Study of War, on Russian hybrid warfare and particularly lessons from Syria, where they use this approach. and then wrote about it. And so we have writings from actually the guys who are commanding the war against Ukraine right now. The commander of the Southern Military District, General Dvornikov, was a commander in Syria and wrote articulately about what he did there. The commander of the Western Military District, Zhuravlev, is another Syria alum and wrote about his experiences there. So they're quite overt about this stuff. The only trick is a lot of the time they describe hybrid warfare as they claim we do it to them. And they describe their activities as defensive against our own hybrid warfare. And that we initiated this hybrid war and they are defending against it. And then in that way, they describe exactly what they have been doing. And so you can see them talking about what they think it is, and then you can see specific actions they take. You can see Russian bot farms that we know work to manipulate our social media, and that has been revealed.
Talk about that in some detail. So what bot farm, what is that exactly? How widespread is it? What is it doing and where?
So this is where you take you program you take computer programs that masquerade as Twitter accounts, for example, and they do lots of different things. Sometimes they will just either tweet out or otherwise message out sort of spam in such volume as to drown out other voices. But a lot of the time what they do is they will repeat Russian messages from lots of different accounts that appear to be independent accounts. So they seem to be corroboration of the Russian narrative, but they're actually all computer programs that are not, they're not even humans, and they're controlled by Russia.
It's a mimicking of a bottom-up process.
Right. I'm not the expert on this. Lots of people on both sides of the political aisle have written about this. There's a lot of technical detail about this, and you can find a lot of, this is not questionable. This is going on is not in question.
Any idea how extensive it is? Like if you're on Twitter, do you have any sense of what proportion of responses that you might be subject to would be?
I don't know. One of the things that's happened is we got wise to this especially after the 2016 election, when the U.S. became, and I don't want to get into that whole election controversy. There are aspects of what was going on that are not in question, including that there were Russian bot farms sending messages, and that they were exposed, and the cyber details are clear of what they were, and so on. As we became aware of that activity, we, the US, the social media companies like Twitter and others started to get very aggressive about developing algorithms to detect when something was a bot and shut them down. So I believe that we're probably subjected to a lot less of this than we were a few years ago. Because, and again, I don't want to get into issues of social media blocking individual humans, because that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, these are machines, and it is possible to detect that something is a machine and not a human, and then to shut it down. And that's one of the things that's been going on. So the social media companies have been doing good work in trying to reduce the number of these things and fight them. So I think you're probably subjected to less of it now than you were in a few years ago, but it's still out there. It's still going on.
Okay, so let's tie the hybrid warfare back in. So what's the goal of the hybrid warfare as far as you're concerned?
So the goal of the hybrid warfare has been to try to achieve Putin's objectives without having to do what he's doing in Ukraine right now. Because hybrid warfare is in part a poor man's game. So we talked about the economic devastation that Russia faced in the 90s. Putin inherited that. Putin has never fixed the Russian economy. The Russian economy is still deeply and fundamentally dysfunctional. Oscillations in energy prices have helped him. Various other things that he's done have helped him gain enough money to be able to rebuild his military to some extent. But his military, until very recently, was simply not capable of posing a serious conventional threat to NATO, or hoping plausibly to defend against NATO if the Russians began a war and NATO seriously leaned into it. So the hybrid warfare approach was designed to help him achieve victories in reconstituting Soviet power one way or another without having to fight wars. And it worked pretty well in some important ways, but it reached limits.
How did it, what ways did it work, do you think?
So what the classic example of hybrid warfare, if you like, was remember the little green men who turned up in Crimea in 2014? And the claims that the Russians were not Russian soldiers, they were local Crimeans who were fed up with alleged Ukrainian oppression and so forth. It became rapidly apparent that they were in fact Russian special forces troops, and that the Russians did in fact have troops in Ukraine. But even that thinnest veneer of implausible deniability led to the following consequence. It led to the establishment by Germany and France with Russia and Ukraine of the Minsk Accords that established the air quotes ceasefire in Ukraine that held ostensibly from 2015 until Putin just broke it by invading. And here's the fascinating thing about the Minsk Accords. Russia is a party to the Minsk Accords as a mediator. What? Russia is a party to the Minsk Accords as a mediator. Nowhere in the Minsk Accords is there a recognition of the fact that it's Russian forces in Ukraine, that the proxy republics that Putin just recognized their independence are Russian controlled, that the chain of command of the forces of those proxies ran to the 8th Combined Arms Army, which is Russia's headquarters in Rostov-on-Don. Nowhere in the Minsk Accords is that recognized. And so
you think that was made plausible, rendered plausible,
Yeah.
or possible even by a successful disinformation or propaganda campaign?
Yep, because the Russian approach, again, and all of this just changed. So, I mean, there's a whole other inflection that we need to talk about the change that's just occurred. But the Russian approach before this invasion had been to use disinformation, misinformation, and sometimes telling the truth in weird ways to generate the following effect: who really knows?
Mm-hmm.
That's been the standard that has been sufficient for Putin a high percentage of the time. And unfortunately, the rising skepticism and mistrust within our own society has been made that pushing a rock downhill. We so mistrust each other at this point that we're inclined to say, well, who really knows? And so when the Russians are creating these opportunities to say, well, who really knows? The point of that is so that we'll say, well, who really knows? So why should we get involved in this? So that instead of reacting to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, which is what actually happened, the Russian military invaded Ukraine in 2014. It seized and then annexed Ukrainian territory in 2014. And then it continued a war in Ukraine from 2014 to the present. The Russian military was doing all of that. Instead of that, we've been talking about ceasefire. I have a sour joke for you, Jordan. I've used this joke right up until the invasion. What do you call it when the armored, mechanized artillery, missile, aircraft, naval, and special forces troops of two countries fight each other? In Ukraine, we call it a ceasefire. Because that's what had been going on.
So by sowing chaos and confusion at the level of information, you sap the moral unity of the people that you're attacking. So they can't unite to justify to themselves even a singular and effective response.
What you do is you isolate the victim, which is what the Russians have done or had done. They isolated Ukraine so that instead of seeing Ukraine simply as the victim of a Russian invasion in 2014, which is what happened, in the West, we've had a lot of conversations about, well, are the Ukrainians living up to their obligations under Minsk? Well, are the Ukrainians doing enough here? And you get rapidly into this, faults on both sides kind of thing, which paralyzes Western response. There aren't faults on both sides. Faults on one side here. There are faults on the side of the Russians who invaded in 2014 and have invaded again. That's faults on one side.
That's the consequence of an injudicious even-handedness.
Right, exactly.
That's a tough one because there's the strong moral impulse to even-handedness and also to self-correction, right? To examine yourself for your own faults, which we seem to be more than good enough in some sense in the West.
Yep.
But that can be capitalized on. And it's an interesting moral conundrum, isn't it? Because there's a time for decisive action, that requires a certain level of moral certainty, and that means you're not even-handed under those conditions. So, okay. So now let me ask you another question that's associated perhaps with the disinformation front. There are many people around the world, in the West as well, claiming that in some real sense, Ukraine isn't an independent state. It's part of Russia. It has been historically. It's not Germany. It's not a country with a clear, like, historical existence. It's a, and so what do you? So you're obviously not very happy with that argument.
By this pastor, an anti-German activist, anti-Nazi activist rather, who said, first they came for the Jews and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for me and by then there was no one left to speak out for me. That is what they are seeking to do to us.